Owning a farm in a suburban neighborhood where even lawn decorations are heavily scrutinized, I knew from the start that my life here wouldn't be easy, but I never expected to find myself at the center of a full-blown HOA battle, one that ended with the very person who called the police being taken away in handcuffs. When I first inherited my grandfather's farm, I felt a deep sense of pride and responsibility. This land had been in my family for generations, and it was more than just property, it was a legacy. The rolling fields, the sturdy red barn, and the familiar scent of fresh earth were reminders of my childhood, of the long summers the first had spent here, learning the trade from my grandfather. The thought of carrying on his work, growing crops, raising livestock, and living off the land filled me with excitement. However, I had no idea that this dream would soon turn into a battle against an overzealous homeowners association led by one particularly insufferable woman. Linda Simmons, the self-proclaimed queen of order in the neighborhood, took an immediate disliking to my presence. The moment she saw my old farmhouse and the livestock roaming the fields, she was on a mission to make my life miserable. She viewed my farm as an eyesore, a blight on her perfectly curated suburban landscape. Unlike the cookie-cutter beige homes with manicured lawns and symmetrical hedges, my farm stood out. It was rustic, authentic, and filled with the lively sounds of nature, things Linda couldn't stand. At first, it started with passive-aggressive comments. Whenever I passed her on the street or saw her at the local grocery store, she would greet me with a tight-lipped smile and say things like, "Oh, I do hope your farm isn't too disruptive," or "We have very high standards in this community. I'm sure you'll do your best to fit in." But soon, her true intentions became clear. Within weeks of moving in, I started receiving letters from the HOA. Each one was more ridiculous than the last. The first letter claimed that my fence was unsightly and demanded that I remove it. Then came complaints about the smell of fresh soil, as if dirt itself was offensive. She even had the audacity to send a letter stating that my farm hands were not allowed to park their trucks on my property because it disrupted the aesthetic harmony of the neighborhood. At first, I tried to ignore her antics. I knew that my farm was legally exempt from HOA rules since it had been established long before the neighborhood even existed. But Linda didn't care about legality, she cared about control. She saw my farm as a personal affront to her authority, and she was determined to find a way to shut it down. Her tactics escalated when she started gathering signatures for a petition to ban livestock within the neighborhood limits. She went door to door, knocking on people's doors with an air of self-importance, insisting that my chickens, goats, and cattle were a nuisance. She claimed they were too loud, unsanitary, and a threat to the neighborhood's tranquility. Never mind that my farm was on private land and had been operational for over a century, Linda was on a crusade. What baffled me the most was that many of my neighbors didn't actually mind my farm. Some even enjoyed it. Children loved seeing the animals, families bought fresh produce from my farm stand, and a few older residents told me they appreciated having a local farmer nearby. But Linda had a way of instilling fear. She warned people that my farm would drive down property values, that the smell would ruin their outdoor gatherings, and that if they didn't support her, they would be forced to endure an unsightly barnyard forever. Despite her efforts, I refused to back down. This was my home, my livelihood, and my family's legacy. I wasn't about to let some overbearing HOA president dictate how I lived. But Linda wasn't done yet. When her petition failed to gain enough traction, she resorted to more drastic measures, filing official complaints with the city and calling in inspectors. One afternoon, I was working in the barn when I saw a city inspector pull up in a government-issued vehicle. He introduced himself and informed me that there had been complaints about zoning violations and unsanitary conditions. I immediately knew who was behind it. Linda had gone to the city, hoping to weaponize regulations against me. I walked the inspector through the farm, showing him the permits, the zoning laws, and the sanitation records. Everything was in order. After a thorough inspection, he shook his head and said, "Honestly, I don't see any issues here. Your farm is up to code, and you have all the necessary exemptions. Whoever filed this complaint either doesn't understand the law or has a personal vendetta." I smirked. It's definitely the latter. The inspector left, but that didn't stop Linda. Over the next few months, she tried everything. She filed noise complaints about my roosters, even though they were pinned far from the houses. She accused me of operating an illegal business because I sold eggs and vegetables at the local farmer's market. She even tried to have my fencing taken down, claiming it blocked the scenic view of the neighborhood. With every failed attempt, her frustration grew. She couldn't stand that her authority was being challenged. That's when she decided to take things to the next level. She called the police. It was a typical afternoon when I heard the wail of sirens. At first, I thought it was just a passing patrol car, but when two police cruisers pulled into my driveway, I knew exactly who was behind it. I wiped my hands on my jeans and stepped outside, where I found Linda standing triumphantly with her arms crossed. The officers stepped out of their vehicles, one of them holding a notepad. "We received a complaint about illegal livestock and zoning violations," one of them said. I let out a slow breath and glanced at Linda. She had that smug look on her face, the one that said she thought she had finally won. But she had no idea what was coming next. After the police visit, I had hoped that Linda would finally back off and accept that my farm was legally protected. But if anything, the setback only fueled her determination to make my life miserable. Her initial schemes had failed, so she turned to even more aggressive tactics, escalating her harassment in ways that were not only infuriating but downright absurd. First, she started weaponizing the HOA rules in creative ways, even though they did not apply to my property. She began sending out newsletters to the neighborhood, subtly suggesting that my farm was a blight on their otherwise pristine community. She painted a picture of my livestock as filthy, disease-ridden animals, claiming that their presence posed a health hazard to the neighborhood's residents. She even went as far as to suggest that my farm was the reason some residents had experienced allergies or increased insect activity in their yards. I couldn't believe it, blaming me for mosquitoes? That was a new low. But the worst came when she started making false reports to local authorities. Linda must have realized that calling the police wasn't enough, so she turned to other government agencies, hoping one of them would find something, anything, to use against me. One morning, a health inspector showed up unannounced. According to him, there had been a complaint about unsanitary conditions related to my farm. I welcomed him in, fully confident that my farm was well-maintained and compliant with every regulation. I led him through the fields, the animal enclosures, and even my storage areas. He took notes, checked sanitation records, and even sampled the water from my well. By the end of the inspection, he shook his head and sighed. "I don't see any issues here," he admitted. "Everything looks up to code." I smirked. "Let me guess. The complaint was anonymous?" The inspector chuckled. "Of course. But between you and me, we get these all the time. It's pretty obvious when someone has a personal grudge." Linda must have been furious when she heard the inspector found nothing. So she doubled down. The next week, an animal welfare officer showed up, claiming that they had received complaints about the cruel conditions in which I kept my livestock. The officer went through my property, examined the enclosures, and even inspected the health of my animals. After a thorough check, she gave me a nod of approval. "Your animals are in great shape," she said. "In fact, I've seen far worse conditions in actual commercial farms. Whoever reported this clearly hasn't seen a real farm before." At this point, I was exhausted but also amused. Linda was relentless, but every single official she called in left with no reason to act against me. However, she wasn't done yet. Linda shifted tactics once again, this time targeting my ability to sell farm products. I had been selling fresh eggs, milk, and vegetables at the local farmers market for years without issue. But one day, I received a notice from the county stating that someone had filed a complaint alleging that I was operating an unauthorized commercial business on my land. I had all the proper permits, so this should have been a non-issue. But Linda had clearly done her homework, digging through every local zoning law she could find in hopes of finding a loophole to use against me. She had taken pictures of my farm trucks, documented delivery schedules, and even printed out flyers from my market stand, claiming that all of these pointed to illegal business operations. She even argued that I was running a retail establishment rather than a farm because I accepted online orders from nearby residents. I spent the next few weeks dealing with county officials, providing documentation that proved I was well within my legal rights. Eventually, they dismissed the complaint, stating that my farm operated under an agricultural exemption. Still, Linda had managed to waste my time, stress me out, and temporarily disrupt my business. Not content with just attacking me, Linda also began targeting the people who worked on my farm. My farmhands started reporting strange encounters with HOA members, who would approach them while they were working and lecture them about proper behavior in the neighborhood. One of my workers, Mike, told me that Linda had confronted him in the driveway, demanding that he park his truck elsewhere because it was ruining the view. "She actually told me that trucks belong in construction sites, not in her neighborhood," Mike said, shaking his head in disbelief. It wasn't just my workers. Linda also tried to intimidate my customers. I had a small produce stand near the road where I sold fresh eggs, honey, and vegetables. One afternoon, I overheard a conversation between Linda and one of my regular customers, an elderly woman named Mrs. Patterson. "You know, it's really not safe to buy from unregulated sellers," Linda said, pretending to be helpful. "You should be careful. You never know what kind of health risks are involved." Mrs. Patterson was having none of it. "Oh, Linda, you do love to meddle, don't you?" she said, laughing. "I've been buying from this farm for years, and I've never been healthier. Maybe you should try eating something fresh for once." Linda stormed off in a huff, but it was clear she was getting desperate. Things reached a boiling point when Linda took it one step too far. She tried to have my farm shut down entirely. She gathered her remaining supporters from the HOA and drafted a petition to rezone my property as residential only, effectively banning agricultural activities. She claimed that my farm was negatively impacting the quality of life in the neighborhood and that removing it would improve property values. The petition made its way to the county board, but before they could even consider it, I fought back. I organized a counter-petition with the help of my supporters, local residents, fellow farmers, and even small business owners who benefited from my produce. We collected signatures, wrote letters, and attended local government meetings to make our voices heard. When the county board finally reviewed the case, they sided with me. The petition was dismissed immediately, and Linda was warned that her continued harassment could result in legal consequences. Her face was priceless when she realized she had lost. But she wasn't done yet. No, her final move would be the most outrageous of all, one that would ultimately be her downfall. She called the police on me. Again, I should have known that Linda wouldn't stop after her petition was denied. She had invested too much time and effort into trying to get rid of my farm, and the idea of admitting defeat was clearly unbearable for her. Her final, most outrageous move was yet to come, and it would ultimately lead to her downfall. One afternoon, while I was working in the barn, I heard the unmistakable sound of sirens in the distance. At first, I assumed it was just an emergency vehicle passing through the neighborhood, but when two police cruisers pulled into my driveway, my stomach dropped. I wiped my hands on my jeans and stepped outside to greet them, already knowing who was behind this. And sure enough, there she was, Linda Simmons, standing triumphantly at the end of my driveway with her arms crossed and a smug smile plastered on her face. One of the officers, a tall, no-nonsense-looking guy, stepped forward. "Sir, we received a complaint about illegal livestock and zoning violations." I sighed and shook my head. "Let me guess. Linda?" "It's Mrs. Simmons," she snapped. "And yes, I reported it. This farm is a nuisance to the neighborhood, and it's time the law did something about it." The officer exchanged a glance with his partner before turning back to me. "We're just here to investigate the complaint. Can you confirm whether your livestock and farm operations are in compliance with county regulations?" "Absolutely," I said, motioning for them to follow me. "I have all the documentation proving that my farm is legally exempt from HOA regulations and is properly zoned for agricultural use." I led them to my office, where I kept copies of all my permits and legal paperwork. They carefully examined the documents, nodding as they verified that everything was in order. Meanwhile, Linda stood outside, tapping her foot impatiently, clearly expecting them to shut me down on the spot. After a few minutes, the officer looked up at me and said, "Everything here checks out, Mr. Hayes. Your farm is legally protected under the state's Right to Farm Act, and there's no violation of any kind." I smirked and turned to Linda. "Well, would you look at that? Seems like my farm isn't going anywhere." Linda's smug expression faltered, but she wasn't done yet. "Oh, I think you'll want to look a little deeper," she said, pulling out a thick stack of printed-out documents. "He's running a commercial business without a permit." The officer sighed and took the papers from her. Flipping through them, he frowned but didn't say anything immediately. I could already tell that Linda thought she had finally won. "What exactly am I being accused of now?" I asked. Linda's grin widened. "You're operating a business in a residential area. You sell produce, eggs, and dairy products at the local farmer's market. That makes this a commercial property, which means you need a different zoning permit." The officer scratched his chin. "Selling at a farmer's market doesn't necessarily make this commercial property, ma'am." Linda's face twitched. "Then what about the trucks? The deliveries? I have pictures of multiple work trucks entering and leaving the property. That's business activity, isn't it?" I rolled my eyes. "Those are farm supply deliveries. This is a working farm, the kind that feeds people." The officer was about to respond when another vehicle pulled up, a black government SUV with tinted windows. Linda frowned as a man in a dark suit stepped out, carrying a briefcase. "Who's that?" she asked suspiciously. I smiled for the first time that day. "Oh, Linda, I think you're about to find out." The man walked straight past Linda and nodded toward the officers. "Good morning, gentlemen. I was asked to come down here for a site visit." Linda's expression morphed from confidence to confusion. "Who are you?" The man turned to her, his expression unreadable. "I'm Daniel Roberts from the State Agricultural Protection Bureau. We received a report that someone was interfering with a legally protected farm." Linda blinked. "The what?" "The Right to Farm Act," Roberts said flatly. "It prevents local ordinances and neighborhood regulations from interfering with legally established agricultural operations." Linda's face turned bright red. "That's ridiculous. This is a residential community." Roberts flipped through the papers Linda had given to the officers, then turned back to me. "Mr. Hayes, you own this farm, correct?" "Yes," I said. "It's been in my family for generations." "And you have all the necessary documentation proving its legal status?" "Correct." Roberts turned back to Linda. "Ma'am, are you aware that this farm has more legal standing here than your HOA?" A pin could have dropped in the silence that followed. Linda opened and closed her mouth like a fish gasping for air. But that's not fair. These people didn't move here to live next to a barnyard." Roberts raised an eyebrow. "And Mr. Hayes wants to keep his legally protected farm, which existed before any of you moved in. If your HOA wanted to avoid agricultural properties, it should have done better research before expanding into farm-adjacent land." Linda actually stomped her foot like a child throwing a tantrum. "This is insane. I've had to put up with the stench, the noise, and the eyesore of this farm for years. It's time it goes." Robert sighed and pulled out his tablet. "Mrs. Simmons, I'll remind you that filing false complaints against a legally protected farm is considered harassment under the state's agricultural laws. Additionally, any attempt to restrict, interfere with, or disrupt its operation without just cause could result in civil penalties." Linda paled. "Civil penalties?" "Yes," Roberts said. "That means fines, lawsuits, and possible liability for any financial damages Mr. Hayes incurs due to your repeated false complaints." I had to bite my lip to keep from laughing. Linda had pushed too far, and now she was paying the price. Still, she refused to go down without one last attempt to shift the blame. "This is corruption," she screeched. You paid these people off. You bribed them to protect your filthy farm." Roberts didn't even react. He simply turned to the officers. "Gentlemen, I believe we're done here. I'll be filing a formal complaint against Mrs. Simmons for repeated malicious legal actions against this farm." The officers nodded. "Ma'am, at this point, we're going to strongly advise that you stop interfering with this property. Continuing down this path could lead to legal consequences." Linda opened her mouth to argue, but one officer cut in. "If you refuse, we'll have to file a formal trespassing complaint." Linda's jaw snapped shut. Her face twisted with rage as she turned on her heel and stormed back toward her house. I let out a slow breath, watching her retreat. Roberts turned to me, shaking his head. "People like that never learn, huh?" "Never," I agreed. With Linda finally defeated and the HOA under scrutiny, my farm was safe. For the first time in years, I felt free. With Linda removed from power and the HOA in full retreat, I thought my ordeal was finally over. My farm was safe, my legal battles were won, and the neighborhood had started to embrace my presence rather than fight it. But while I was ready to move on, justice still had a path to take, and Linda was far from done facing the consequences of her actions. In the days following Linda's removal as HOA president, rumors began swirling. Many residents who had once supported her, or at least feared speaking against her, were now coming forward with their own grievances. It turned out that Linda had not just been harassing me, but she had also been running the HOA like her personal fiefdom, imposing arbitrary fines and collecting money that seemingly disappeared without explanation. Emboldened by my victory, a group of homeowners banded together to file an official complaint with the county's housing authority. They demanded a financial audit of the HOA's funds. It didn't take long before investigators uncovered massive discrepancies in the records. Linda had been levying fines against homeowners for years, pocketing portions of the money under false pretenses. What was supposed to be used for neighborhood improvements had instead funded her lavish personal expenses. The revelation sent shockwaves through the community. Homeowners who had previously feared retaliation now realized that they had been victims of fraud. The scandal spread quickly, drawing media attention and further exposing the corruption that had ruled our neighborhood for years. Local news outlets caught wind of the growing controversy and started reporting on the case. They interviewed frustrated residents, former HOA members, and even legal experts who explained just how deep Linda's misconduct ran. When a news crew showed up at my farm, I agreed to speak on camera, not just for myself, but for everyone who had suffered under Linda's rule. I walked them through my experience, how she had falsely accused me of violations, weaponized local authorities against me, and tried to destroy my livelihood simply because she didn't like the way my farm disrupted her vision of the neighborhood. Other residents spoke out as well. Elderly homeowners who had been fined for minor landscaping violations, families who had been threatened with legal action over trivial infractions, and even former HOA board members who admitted they had been pressured into complying with Linda's demands. By the time the segment aired that evening, the public backlash against Linda was immense. Social media erupted with criticism, and the authorities had no choice but to act. With mounting evidence of fraud, financial misconduct, and abuse of power, law enforcement launched a full-scale investigation into Linda's activities. Weeks later, an arrest warrant was issued. One evening, while I was tending to my crops, I received a call from Mr. Reynolds, a former HOA member who had since turned against Linda. "Turn on the news," he said, his voice filled with satisfaction. I rushed inside and switched on the TV. Sure enough, there it was, live footage of police cars parked outside Linda's house. Officers were escorting her out in handcuffs as reporters swarmed the scene, shouting questions she refused to answer. The woman who had spent years bullying and intimidating others had finally been brought down by her own greed and arrogance. In the weeks that followed, Linda faced multiple charges, including fraud, embezzlement, and harassment. The evidence against her was overwhelming: bank statements, false financial reports, and testimonies from dozens of residents who had been wronged. When the trial began, I was called to testify, along with several other neighbors who had suffered under her rule. As I stood in court and recounted everything she had done, from filing false complaints against my farm to illegally imposing fines on innocent homeowners, I could see the weight of it finally sinking in. The once smug and self-important Linda now sat stone-faced, realizing that she was about to face the consequences of her years of abuse. The verdict was swift: guilty. Linda was sentenced to serve time for financial crimes and ordered to pay restitution to the homeowners she had defrauded. Additionally, a restraining order was issued to ensure she could never again interfere with my farm, or anyone else's, through legal manipulation. With Linda gone and the HOA dismantled, the neighborhood underwent a remarkable transformation. Gone were the oppressive regulations that had dictated every aspect of people's lives. Homeowners reclaimed their freedom, repainting their houses in colors they actually liked, planting gardens without fear of fines, and enjoying their properties without HOA interference. As for my farm, it flourished like never before. Neighbors who had once kept their distance now became loyal customers. Families visited regularly, buying fresh produce, eggs, and dairy. Some even volunteered to help during harvest season, eager to be part of something that had once been at the center of controversy, but had now become a source of community pride. One of the most gratifying moments came when Mrs. Patterson, the elderly woman who had stood by me from the beginning, stopped by with a warm smile and a fresh-baked pie. "I told you she'd get what was coming to her," she said, handing me the pie. People like that always do. A lesson in standing up. This story is not just about a farm. It's about standing up for what's right, even in the face of relentless opposition. It's about knowing your rights, refusing to be intimidated, and fighting back against those who abuse power. Too often, people let fear silence them. But the truth is, when we stand together against injustice, change is inevitable. Linda believed she could control others through manipulation and fear, but in the end, justice caught up with her. Her downfall serves as a reminder that those who misuse power will eventually face the consequences of their actions. If you found this story inspiring, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share to support our channel. Join us at Story Precious for more real-life tales of perseverance, justice, and triumph over adversity. Hit the notification bell to never miss an update. We bring you stories that matter. Together, Let's celebrate stories of resilience and learn that no matter how tough the battle, standing up for what's right is always worth it.